Thank you. Good evening. I would like to thank Susanna Rosmanino for inviting me over and the cultural organization that you manage, Container and Content, as well as the Gulbenkian Foundation for hosting us and Penelope Curtis. So, as Susanna just introduced, I'm heading the museum in the Cité of the l'Architecture and the Patrimoine, so one of the departments. Let me get this going. Works. Okay. So the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine, for a reminder, opened in 2007. And it's a national institution, public institution, that is depending on the Ministry of Culture. Actually, we are the merger of three former institutions, quite different, and this is a point to stress out. The Musée des Monuments Français originates in the 19th century, was inaugurated in 1882. The École de Chaillot, School for Heritage Training, was founded, originates in 1887. And the IFA, Institut Français d'Architecture, was founded a century later in 1980, at the moment when there was a new urge for history and history of architecture. We are also an active member of ICAM, the Confederation of the International Confederation of Architectural Museums, and it's an important point also for us to be really in the midst of a network, an international network. So I would like to, before I go more into the different departments and the relations between collections, audiences, and architecture, talk a little bit more about our missions and give you a general scope of the Cité. Well, of course, our first mission is to foster general culture, general education for architecture and for heritage. Maybe the first point is to support architectural creation and to valorize and diffuse this information about architectural collection. But close behind comes the collection policy, collecting, preserving, displaying, studying the collections that we have been entrusted with, and also collecting an archive, preserving architectural archives. The collections, and in more generally the Cité also has a very important view on research, and we do try to foster as much as possible research in architecture history or in heritage or in with contemporary issues. I talked about the networks, and maybe also because this is quite specific to our institution and it doesn't appear always very clearly publicly, but we have a strong mission in education, in professional training through the school, professional training in heritage. This is the building we are in. It's the Palais de Chaillot. It is in front of the Eiffel Tower, if you know Paris, of course. It was founded in the 1878 Universal Exhibition, so that's the picture on the left side. And on the right side, you have a view of the building as it was remodeled after 1937, another Universal Exhibition. And this is how it stands today. It hosts actually four institutions, the Cité, but also a national theater, a museum for mankind, a museum for marine. So the Cité occupies one of the wings of the building, and we are actually, most big institutions in Paris are one thing. I mean, they are a museum, and there's a general drive in one direction, a museum. We are, and we still are, sort of a conglomerate. What I mean by that, and it's positive in my meaning, I mean we are a museum, but we also are, the museum is in blue. We also are a library, a public library, it's in pink. We also are a school that you find in yellow. We also have the exhibitions galleries, of course, in green, and we have a platform called Contemporary Architecture. And on top of that, we have the Archive Center. It's important to bear that in mind because it means that we're an institution that does simultaneously have different drives, all about architecture, but still with very different missions and different attitudes towards audiences and towards the way of dealing with our missions. The staff of the Cité is about 140 people, and that's only for the direct staff of the Cité, because all the the guards, the maintenance of the building is externalized. I also put up, to give you an idea about the budget of the institution, we're more or less yearly on a budget about 20 million euros, 14 millions that come directly from the Ministry of Culture, and the 6 others that we have to bring in through, of course, ticketing, through the rental of space, sponsors. And to give you also an idea of our audiences, altogether we're over, well, last year was a particularly very nice year. We were over the 450,000 visitors, as you can see on the slide. The museums and exhibitions are more or less around 354,100 yearly visitors a year. And when we come down to the permanent collections only, so when you talk about Museum of Architecture, that's interesting how much the permanent collections bring in. It's about 150,000 visitors a year. So let's go on to the museum itself. The museum, as I said, was a 19th century museum first. It was called the Museum of Compared Sculpture. This is the title is quite important because it was focused on the rediscovery of art, more than architecture, and of medieval art. You see how the rooms were when it was first built, and it's not necessarily very different today for the cast galleries. These collections are collections of casts, so life-size, quite fascinating pieces of sculpture and architecture. At the time, of course, and because we were in the 19th century, there was quite a strong nationalistic approach to the collection. It was a collection that was brought together to show how important and fabulous the French Gothic was, as seen versus English Gothic and versus, more especially, opposed to German Gothic. And what is also important to bear in mind, I think, is that the collection was built with very close ties to the creation of the National Heritage Service. National Heritage in France began around 1830. 1840, the museum comes up around 1870, and so the museum's scientific basis, all the discovery, all the knowledge that was built up at the time on medieval monuments, medieval sculpture. And I put this slide to show you how closely linked our collections are and were to an architect whose name is Eugène-Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. Viollet-le-Duc is in France really the founder of restoration thought, practice, and knowledge at the time. Also one of the first to really write on medieval architecture. He also had a great influence as a rationalist architect, so a great influence on 20th century architecture. The second change for the museum came in 1937, when the museum became a Musée des Monuments Français, a museum of French monuments. And the major point is that we switched from architecture to really monumental art. The director of the time built a collection of mural painting replicas that you can see here, 2 examples. They were also very closely linked to the rediscovery, also by the National Heritage, of mural painting throughout all of French churches around the territory from the beginning of the century till the 1930s. There had been a lot of rediscovery of paintings under white that had been painted white in between. So still just strong ties to heritage, but a museum oriented towards art more than architecture. We also built up a small collection of stained glass at the time. Now, when the museum was brought into the Cité de l'Architecture, of course, a new drive had to be implemented because the Cité's mission is architecture and heritage. The modern and contemporary collection and gallery were created at the time and opened. It's a thoroughly new collection, and it was opened in 2007. It's dedicated always to French architecture, but from 1850 to nowadays. What had underlined our work on this gallery was really to stress out, to point out innovation and creativity all throughout the period from the 19th century all the way to the 20th century and nowadays. So innovation, modernity, more than tradition or continuity. Sometimes we insist more on the changes that appear than on the continuity from the way I see what we have built up. The architecture collection, well, the collection, I would say, is what you would expect of an architecture collection nowadays: models, drawings, some architectural fragments. It really shows the project process, the constructive process, and also it gives a very good analysis of urban or architectural issues. So if I must summarize our collection today, it's a collection, as you can see, of monumental art and architecture of national scope. That was something that was a decision taken from our ministry. And I must also point out that it's more based on the masterpiece than on the ordinary work. And our audience, because we have had audience studies, really point that part also is that they do come for the masterpieces of architecture, even of 20th century architecture or of medieval architecture. Maybe I'm pointing this out because it is an issue, because our national policy in France also supports quality of architecture, but also wants us to work more on the urban fabric a lot more. And as a museum, it's not an easy thing to do, I find. One of the great qualities of our collection regarding architecture is the importance of the analytical models. They were created by the museum. As you can see, the eldest ones go up to the 19th century with the origins of the museum. It was a collection that was mainly based to analyze the structure of the buildings in order to restore them, actually. And the more recent collection deals much more with it's an analysis of structure, of construction, but also of distribution or also of urban strategies. So what are our future orientations and the points that we are dealing with right now? Well, first of all, our aim is, because the museum deals with the broadest public, I would say, in the Cité. So it is to give a better understanding for architecture, for the city, for heritage, and also, I would say, for monumental art, though that's not the first drive. So it's really to reinforce our role as a place for education. And through the collection, our aim is to really give a testimony of the importance of creativity, of innovation, all throughout time. There's this continuity about the never-ending creation and rethinking the issues of society. And that was true in the Middle Ages, and it is true today, and that's what we want to show through our permanent collection. The museum audiences, in the Cité, the museum is, as I said, deals with the broadest audience, I think. So many individuals. These individuals are seeking for a better understanding of architecture. But what's interesting also to note is that we have, even though we have been open now for 7 years, we still have a very important amount of first-time visitors that come to the museum. And so these first-time visitors come for that kind of general approach, and they also come to see the masterpieces. So that's how things link up together. Rather low number of tourists. We are smack in front of the Eiffel Towers. We have loads of tourists right next to us, but they don't come in, and they probably won't. We're not too good in our English translations, but they probably won't for another reason. It's because we're a specialized institution already. So when you go to Paris, you go to see the Louvre, you go to see Beaubourg. When you end up at the Cité de l'Architecture, it's because it's at least your second time in Paris. Museums, well, that's important for an architecture museum. You won't be the first one visited. Museum audiences. Our other main public are the schools and students, because they do amount to about 29,000 children per year who come over to visit. The aim is not exactly the same, of course, between children and students, children being driven by their teachers rather in the scope of their history programs, whereas the students are generally students related to architecture, to art history, to design, or human sciences. And I would like to conclude on audiences to point out the importance of the interdisciplinary aspect to bring people to architecture. We've been really experiencing that. One of our successful events are what we call Carpe Noctem nights, enjoy the night. And these nights are moments where we bring in professions of photography one night, or music another night, dance another night, and drawing another night. And these professionals interact with the collection and the public and offer workshops in their own speciality. And it's quite successful. I will go on to the Center for Architecture Archives. So it was built up in 1980, and it's now in France really the most important center for architecture archives. We have over 400 architectural archives and a great knowledge in dealing with them. The mission of the Archive Center is to preserve 20th century archive, not the former periods. And of course to provide archival sources for research. But what is also quite specific, I think, is that we have been, it wasn't clearly expressed, but it just happened to end up like this. We are right now the national platform for identifying and dispatching archives all over France. So, because usually the offers come to us and then we have to talk over if we take them or if we dispatch them to either national, regional, or local archives in the country. What are the strengths of the archives? Well, first of all, there's a whole part of the collection that deals with what I would call soft modernism, that is, as opposed to Le Corbusier. So it would be Art Deco, it would be more classical modernism or regionalism. Another part of the collection is closely linked to rationalism and concrete, the architects who built with concrete. But now the core of the archives are really post-war archives. The big guys, all the big guys in France, I would say, have their archives at the Archive Center. The ones who built, the ones who built out throughout the whole country. That's another example. Quite fun. What are the agencies for the Archive Center? Well, of course, there are mostly researchers and professionals who, many curators also, and we have quite a lot of loans also for exhibitions. And I would like to point out the importance of the database when you are dealing with whatever collections. That's an issue for our museums and for our Archive Center. Our archival database is really quite good and offers a lot of images of the collections. And it's interesting to see that the collections, thus, especially the ones that have photos, are highly lent. And it's interesting to see that the museum collection right now has just been put online. So until now, we have rather a low number of loans that are asked for. And we really do hope that putting the collection online will help to make it be more known and travel more. The issues that we are dealing with concerning archives are the issues that many architectural museums and centers are dealing with too. Well, first of all, to expand the realm of our collections. As I said, we're quite good on post-war, but we need to move on and to be really representative and a conservatory for architectural archives of the 1980s and 1990s. We have to figure out, in that respect, how to deal and how to collect, preserve, transmit digital archives, which is an ongoing issue for all institutions. Another question, though, might be, should we change our acquisition policy model? Because we've been rather taking in whole archives, and they're really big archives after all. So they're they're slow track collecting. Should we move on and be more fast track, and in that respect, not get in whole archives that we're unable anyway to classify, but should we try to pre-select more the works that come in before or parts of the archive? That's one of the issues we're dealing to right now. And another important thing maybe to point out, I think, is that there seems to be a decrease in the use done by research with architectural archives. At least that's what we experience. A decrease seems to be like, I would say 5 years, something like that. 5 years, and we do not see as many students willing to handle the archives, willing to go in there and take time to go through the archives. So we're kind of having the impression that what we're collecting is not going to be useful for this generation right now, but for the next one. Now, moving onwards a bit further from collections, I would like to talk to you about other types of audiences and programs that we have put forward. We've opened the platform for contemporary architecture last autumn. So this is quite different from the archives and the museum in the respect that it is directly organized for a professional public, should it be architects, town planners, companies, and for students. And the mission of the platform is to echo critical and prospective attitudes toward architecture. That is mainly through debates, conferences, interactions, and also to inform quite regularly on what's happening. So this is a much more active and reactive type of programming. One of the very interesting things that has been set up are the invitations made to duos that are 2 agencies that are invited for 2 months in a series of not confrontations but debates, discussions on topics that relate to both of these agencies. There's usually one French agency and one European one. And the first session has already taken place between TWK and RAF in Amsterdam. It was really very interesting because we had like 200 people in the rooms, a lot of students and young people, young professionals actually, who were very interested to listen to what was happening also, and very much interactive. The role of critics also are important, and we've been setting up now these regular rendezvous with a group of 4 critics to talk about the current issues and about urban planning, architecture. Oh, and what was important also regarding those rendezvous, I think, is that to mention that we've made this partnership with France Culture, so they're broadcasted. And that about being able to broadcast what you're doing, it really, really is interesting to widespread what you're doing. We've also been setting up recently what didn't exist before, the Cultural Development Department, which actually really works in the auditorium, functions in the auditorium. And here again, what's interesting is that the public it's aimed at getting a broader audience to contemporary architecture, but by working with interdisciplinary approaches. So we have different lines of programs that we're setting up, architecture and cinema, architecture and photography, or rather photography and architecture, literature and architecture. And one of the main lines of the different conferences and evenings and debates that are being staged is the theme of sustainability. Of course, through debates with architects and town planners, but also with philosophers, economists, and trying to broaden the number of people that we're inviting over to talk about architecture. Maybe it's important to stress, because it might seem obvious like this, but when we started, most of our conferences were really given either by architects or by town players, mayors, so people really only from within the profession. And we're really trying not to crisscross and develop broader links. And the result is there also because we do touch a different type of public through these different evenings. Just a short notice also that we worked on the sustainability matters a lot with the global awards for sustainable architecture that have been founded by Jana Rivedin, and we've been developing a series of conferences now in relation with her. I would like to end with a quick note about exhibitions, because I think that what my presentation really wants to point out is that to widespread a culture of architecture, as it's our mission, is really try and reach as many different publics as you can. And the exhibitions are really show that way of doing things. So, for example, we have been, on one hand, staging exhibitions that would be very similar to, you would say, big Beaux-Arts Museum exhibitions, the Art Deco exhibition, which has been our highest score regarding the attendance, about 200,000 visitors, is an exhibition that was talking about art, about design, and about architecture. There was a lot of architecture in it. It's not explicit at first, but there was a lot of architecture in it. And so it's a great way of bringing people over on the kind of general exhibition, and then afterwards to get them to your programs and to get them into more maybe pointed kind of problematics. On the other hand, we have exhibitions such as Un bâtiment combien de vies, that would be translated as How Many Lives for a Building. That was also staged last year. It was an exhibition that addressed a much more interested public, either professionals or public with a high interest in architecture. And we had quite a good attendance too, with our 38,000 visitors, which is a good score regarding our exhibitions. What we do see is that monographs don't work that much. Every time we do a monography, it's rather a low score compared to all the thematic or the interdisciplinary exhibitions, which really shows, I think, how much it's the expectation regarding exhibitions, at least, is an expectation to cross links, to get things linked together, more just to get into one theme. And it's important because usually for the broader public, architecture is seen as a very specialized thing, or a thing for specialists, and that's precisely what we have all to overcome. That architecture is not a thing for specialists. It's all over, around us. It really has great impact on the quality of our lives, and it deals with all the other arts too. Among the exhibitions, just to point out that we're going to host this year, we are hosting in April an exhibition, Les Universitaís, on contemporary architecture in Portugal from 1965 to 2015, and it is produced with the Fondation Gulbenkian. So to conclude, one drive, which is to promote a culture for architecture, several means: collections, archives, exhibition, training, research, and just to reach out don't hesitate to reach out for different audiences and to listen to what they want also. Not only just what we want to say, but what are the people coming from. Sometimes they're just coming for a good time and having coffee. And that's very important, just to get them in, because they'll come back again. So listen to all science and fun, and interdisciplinarity also, which seems to have been in the recent years one of the issues that we're really trying to deal with. Thank you.